Now, on to our second point. So what was going wrong at the beginning of the 16th century that led to the explosion of the Protestant Reformation? Lots of things were going wrong. It was a really bad period in the history of the church. Sometimes we miss that because, there's Michelangelo and Raphael and Donatello and all the other turtles are all there doing their stuff. And people think that, therefore they must have been a wonderful period. But it really, 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 really wasn't. So why wasn't it? Okay, well, for a start, the popes were really terrible people. They're extremely corrupt. They had been for several decades. Lots of illegitimate children, weren't really interested in theology and religion, all that stuff. Well, I mean, a little bit, perhaps. But they were mostly interested in beautiful buildings and Renaissance paintings and writing beautiful Latin in an archaizing pagan style and all this kind of stuff, and it was just frankly hideously embarrassing, and didn't look as if it had anything to do with the gospel or our Lord Jesus Christ. The Pope, who was reigning at the time at which Luther kicked off the Reformation, famously said when he was elected Pope, "Since it has pleased God to bestow upon us the papacy, we are determined to enjoy it," which is not the right attitude when you are elected Pope. So that's one of the big problems. Another problem, which probably lies behind that first problem, is what's called the Renaissance. Again, it sounds great. They made up the term Renaissance themselves, the people who were behind it, in order to congratulate themselves. But in fact, the Renaissance was a bit of a disaster. So the Renaissance is a kind of huge, crushing movement of literary snobbery, essentially, is what it is. So in the 14th century, so 200 years before the Reformation happened, that was a really bad century as well, and half the population of Europe or more died in the most horrific plague, which I'm sure everyone's heard of, the Black Death. There was a massive war between England and France that went on for more than 100 years and is consequently called the 100 Years' War, and everyone's killing each other, and it seemed to rain non-stop for 100 years, and everyone's just crashing around in the mud. There was a horrible new philosophical movement, which we'll come back to because Luther belonged to it, called the Via Moderna, which dug up all the basic foundations of Western philosophy laid by Socrates and Plato and Aristotle and made a complete mess of Western thought. And the popes just went off to France for 70 years because it was such a hassle living in central Italy. And this caused complete chaos. And then finally they were intimidated into going back by St. Catherine of Siena and St. Bridget of Sweden. And then when they did go back and finally elected an Italian pope, all the French cardinals fell out with the new Italian pope and stormed off back to back to France rather, and elected a rival pope. So then there was another 4 decades of several different popes, ultimately 3 at the same time, all claiming to be the real pope, making complete mockery of the organization of the church. So this had generally created a climate of irreligion and an intellectual confusion and cultural demoralization in Christendom. And this kind of prepared the way for the coming of the Reformation. But the most terrible of all of these, really, it was this philosophical revolution called the Via Moderna. So from the ancient world up until the 14th century, the prevailing and dominant and almost exclusively adhered to form of philosophy in the West was what's called realism, which is the belief that there really are natures to things. That when I say, look, there's a rowan tree, there's a cedar tree, there's an oak tree, and there's a birch tree, the word tree really does refer to the same thing in each case. It's not just an arbitrary way of grouping things. It actually corresponds to reality. As Plato says, the mind carves reality at the joints. Now, the opposite of this is a false doctrine called nominalism, which is simply that there are no real true natures, there are only individual things. Now, this doctrine is revived. It has reared its ugly head at various points in the history of Western thought, but it's revived by, sadly, an English Franciscan called William of Ockham in the 14th century, and it becomes it takes over half of the universities of the West, either whole universities or half of any given university, and there's this kind of massive war going on between the followers of the Socratic tradition, Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, called the Via Antiqua, the ancient way, and then the followers of this new revived nominalism, really revival of the errors of the sophists, the great enemies of Socrates, called the Via Moderna. And indeed, the whole idea of modernity, of the modern era, the word originally just meant now or contemporary, but it became to mean a distinct era in human history, distinguished from the Middle Ages and from the ancient world. And this idea of modernity comes from this philosophical movement, the Via Moderna. Now, this era has three very serious consequences. It has one immediate consequence in the moral order and then three general consequences. The immediate consequence of the moral order is what's called voluntarism. That is the belief that right and wrong does not correspond to objective reality or the nature of things, because, of course, there is no nature to things if you're a nominalist. So whereas if you're Thomas Aquinas or Augustine or Boethius or Socrates or Plato or Aristotle, you think that a bad apple is a squishy brown apple with a wriggly worm running through it and a kind of weird leprous grey stuff growing up the side. That's a bad apple. And a good apple is spherical and sweet and crunchy, and just delicious. And when you perceive that, you're objectively perceiving that the second of those two is an excellent example of the nature of apples, and the first is a poor, very poor example of the nature of apples, and that's an objective observation. And the same thing applies to human beings. A degenerate, lying, adulterous murderer is a bad human being, and a heroic war veteran martyr bishop is a good human being. So you just see that objectively one person has fulfilled the potential of human nature and the other one has squandered it, right? And that corresponds to objective morality. Now, you can't get rid of that. You can't have any of that if you're a nominalist. So instead, you have to believe in what's called command theory. You have to hold that right and wrong is right and wrong either because God or because the state tells you that it is. And they could change their mind tomorrow, and then right and wrong would be something different. And this is noxious and terrible, and it results in these three principal further errors. One is Protestantism, and we're going to talk about that in a second. The second is idealism. So the idea that we don't really know the world, we only know our own ideas. Because if a dog isn't really a dog and a tree isn't really a tree and a cabbage isn't really a cabbage, then what I basically see when I experience things is actual things. If I have no knowledge of general natures, then I have no knowledge of actual things. So then that means that reality must be made of something that I don't actually perceive, that generates the effect of me having the idea of cabbage or dog or tree. But in fact, there are no such things as cabbages and dogs and trees because there are no general natures. So that means essentially I'm living in a kind of weird dream world. So the entire Matrix franchise and the philosophy of Descartes all comes out of this original era of nominalism. And then the third era is what's called contractualism, which is the idea that whereas according to the ancients, the medievals, the reason why you have to obey the law is because you're naturally, by your nature, you're a social animal. You live in society. That society needs laws. You have to decide which side of the road people are going to drive on and how many pennies there are going to be in the pound. Otherwise, no one's going to be able to buy anything and everyone's going to crash headlong into everybody else. So there has to be an authority derived from nature and therefore instituted by the author of nature, God, in order to regulate society, and therefore you're obliged morally to obey the law by the same objective morality as makes a squishy brown apple with a wriggly worm a bad apple. But you can't have any of that, again, if you're a nominalist, because there's no nature to be the ground of that authority. So instead, the idea is that the authority of rulers is derived from the consent of the governed. And that sounds wonderful, oh, marvellous, how democratic. But of course, that's nonsense. If that were true, then I could just be stopped by a policeman. He says, excuse me, sir, but you're driving at 65 miles an hour in a 55 mile an hour area. And I say, yes, but I'm withdrawing my consent from that law. So carry on, good man, and leave me alone. Well, obviously that's nonsense. You can't do that. So you have to claim that there's a mythical, mighty contract that everybody, even though they can't quite remember it, have all agreed unanimously to do whatever the state tells them in advance. And it's too late. No backsies. You can't take it back. There's no. You're bound hand and foot forever this state. And it's not, whereas in the other theory, the state is authorities derived from morality. So it's fine for the state to say drive on the right and there's 100 cents in the dollar. But if the state says, shoot all the left-handed people and steal other people's wives so long as they have short sight or something, whatever, then the state can get lost. It can't do any of those things. It doesn't have the power to contradict morality, because morality is the branch that it sits on, so it can't saw it off. So the state is created by the moral law, but also limited by the moral law. Whereas in this nominalist nightmare, the state is created by this imaginary mythical contract, which you never remember signing, but you're bound by forever, and it can do whatever it wants, and there's nothing you can do about it. It creates right and wrong, and morality is no limitation to its power. So modern totalitarianism comes out of nominalism, the ruin of modern philosophy, where we all end up wondering whether we even exist or whether we're trapped in a sensory deprivation tank by an evil demon. That is all derived from nominalism. And also, first in the queue is Protestantism. So let's get on to Protestantism. But before we do so, let's look at how those problems in the church that we were talking about, that provide the context, gave birth to the individual who kicked it all off, Martin Luther.